Nintendo has been producing video games for a long time, nearly 40 years. But in all that time, few have been comparable in sheer quantity and popularity as The Legend of Zelda. This series has been around for so long that, at the time of this video, we are currently celebrating its 35th anniversary. And along the span of those 35 years, Nintendo and, Capcom, for some reason, has put out 19 games all bearing the title of Zelda and being considered part of its canon. Though I'm happy to see it successful, I also can't help but notice that most of the series' fans seem to have only played anywhere between 1 and 3 of the games, and therefore don't know how the series has changed and evolved over the course of the last 35 years. After all, who could possibly have the time or patience to play through every Zelda game and catalog their thoughts on them? It's me. I'm the guy who did that. And now, I want to share this knowledge in order to answer the question I'm sure is on everyone's minds. Should you play every Legend of Zelda game? No! God, no. There are some really bad games in the Zelda franchise, and I will get to those someday. But besides that, if these games were all great, then there would be no point in reviewing any of them. I'd just say, they're all great. Play any one you like. But I also want to be able to help those who might be looking for a good Zelda game to play, and to find one that also fits with their particular preferences. And to do that, I will be making this series of videos detailing why I think these many different games are either good or terrible, so that you, the individual watching this, can decide if it's worth your time or not. So on that note, let's start by answering a little question. What was the catalyst for this series of videos, and why do I care about helping people find Zelda games that they might like or not? At the Nintendo Direct held on the 17th of February, it was announced that The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword would be ported to the Switch come July 16th. This was met with mixed responses. Many complaints from fans had to do with the full $60 price tag for what was essentially just a port of an old game, as well as the price of the special edition controller, which, alright, that does look pretty cool, but it was still $70. For context, the Skyward Sword Special Edition, released back in 2011, came in a nice cardboard box that also included the Special Edition controller, the standard game, and a CD that contained the live 1-hour 25th Anniversary Symphony. The price for this was $70, the same as the new Joy-Con controller, which may very well have the same drift problems that have plagued these damn things for years now. So if that didn't already help you understand why people were not happy about this release, also keep in mind that many older Zelda fans hate Skyward Sword, and it's often labeled as one of the Zelda series' worst games. Still, none of those complaints are what bothered me in particular. No, what got to me was Eiji Aonuma, the series' current producer, trying to convince people who had only played Breath of the Wild that Skyward Sword had any similarity to that game whatsoever.
Many of you may already know this, but The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword was the last original console game prior to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild game, and it was still following the established conventions of The Legend of Zelda. However, it gave a glimpse into many features and innovations that would eventually be adopted in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Using the sailcloth to descend in midair, a stamina gauge that depleted as you scaled walls with vines or ran, even the concept of collecting items to upgrade gear. I hope those of you who've played The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild will give this game a try as well.
This was clearly an attempt at advertising the game to fans that have only played Breath of the Wild, with the knowledge that Skyward Sword's actual game design probably won't appeal to them. Nintendo knows this, and clearly wants to sell it to them anyway, since most people who got Skyward Sword on the Wii probably won't buy it again. And so, Aonuma decided to sell it to them as if it was the Zelda game that influenced the design philosophy of Breath of the Wild, which it most certainly did not. And to clarify, I'm totally fine with these new Zelda fans who only like Breath of the Wild. It's not something I'm trying to discourage. After all, Breath of the Wild has a pretty captivating design philosophy that, thus far, has managed to attract a completely new audience. And considering that it is now the best-selling Zelda game ever, as well as the most recent, it is no surprise that so many current Zelda fans are newcomers with little experience of the other games. But now, Nintendo is trying to sell these new fans Skyward Sword, a game which is the antithesis of Breath of the Wild in nearly every way. If even back in 2011, Zelda fans thought this game was too linear and hand-holding, then I can imagine the disappointment that Breath of the Wild fans might have when they get their hands on it. For today's Zelda fan, I can't help but feel like Nintendo is making the wrong move here if they really want to expand their customer base. If they really wanted to celebrate Zelda's history while also encouraging new fans to purchase their old games, I can't help but feel like there's a whole library of much better choices. And that is what brings us to this very moment. For the sake of all of those who wish to know what games of Zelda past they should play, and what titles among them should be expelled to the deepest reaches of gaming hell, I am here to review all of the Zelda games so that you don't have to. Starting today's video with, of course, the game that started it all. The very first Legend of Zelda. Back in the long ago days of gaming, when the Atari 2600 ruled supreme, video games took on a very different form than they do today. In those days, the arcade reigned supreme, and a great number of console games were just at-home ports of arcade titles. The design philosophy of video games back in this era was, how do we make a game that hooks a player in from the moment they put in the quarter, and makes them want to put another one in once they die, which was usually pretty quick. The resulting games were classic titles like Pac-Man, Galaga, Yar's Revenge, and Missile Command. These were games that anyone could understand the objective of and just play for an afternoon before picking it up again the next day. There was no player investment or immersion in this era. No storylines, no characters. Hell, most games didn't even include any actual human sprites or dialogue. And this continued to hold true throughout the pre-Zelda era. Games were not meant to be a major investment of time, and that's why the only thing you could point to track your progress was the high score. While it's almost comical to see this in any modern game, back in the arcade days, it was the driving factor towards players coming back the next day, as video games could not be saved. But then, something changed. The video game market crashes. The Atari 2600 and the company as a whole die off in the span of a couple nights, and suddenly the American market is open for the Nintendo Entertainment System to come through. Nintendo also made arcade games, but unlike Atari, who tried and failed to move on from the 2600, Nintendo was trying to build further on the NES, known as the Famicom back in Japan, and they did this through one major breakthrough: the Famicom Disk System. You see, video games up until this point were on cartridges, and what sucks about a cartridge back in 1985 is that it can't hold much data, and it can't save any new game data either. But, for my younger viewers out there was an ancient piece of technology recently unearthed at Nintendo headquarters that allowed the developers to bypass this limitation, called the floppy disk. The Famicom Disk System debuted using this mysterious ancient tech on February 21st, 1986. If that date sounds familiar to you at all, then it is probably because its launch title, unlike the floppy disk it debuted on, is still within the vein of common human knowledge. That launch title was the original Legend of Zelda. Now, why do you need to know this? Well, because I want you to understand something very fundamental about this first Zelda game before I analyze it. This game ushered in a completely new era of video game design, and as such, was forced to apply a very different philosophy to its design. Zelda would not, like any of its predecessors, be a simple time killer, or a competition between friends at the arcade. Zelda was an adventure, and while a lesser game by a lesser developer would have likely crumbled under such pressure, The Legend of Zelda manages to stand out with an iron fist among its contemporaries, and to this day remains an incredible game that I believe is still a top contender among the series' many titles. Why that is mostly due to its hands-off approach to game design, by allowing the player to mostly figure things out for himself, without a constant guiding hand to annoy him, and also without becoming too confusing and losing his interest. More specifically, this game, much like the Zelda series' most recent iteration, decides to teach the player its mechanics without a litany of dialogue accompanying it, and this applies to every part of the game. But what better place to start this adventure than with the very beginning? As soon as you get through the File Select menu, a choice is immediately presented to the player. 4 paths lie ahead of you, 3 identical looking roads facing west, north, and east, and a black door leading inside a cave. This is the first instance of Zelda's hands-off method of teaching the player how the game works. Immediately, the player now understands a few fundamental rules about the game world. That he can choose where he goes, that the world is segmented by screens via paths, and that there are discoverable caves within those screens. The most obvious choice, especially considering the player's lack of a weapon, is to take the one different path, the cave, which is the correct one, but even still, you're allowed to make your own choices and can set out unarmed into the wild. Now, unless you're this guy and have played the game long enough to beat it without a weapon, then you'll promptly die and learn another very important lesson. The world is dangerous, a line that the old man in the cave will echo. And so, eventually, through the player's own sense of self-preservation and common sense, you'll go into the cave, receive the wooden sword, and finally begin your adventure in earnest. Now, already, in the span of 10 seconds, the player is taught everything they need to know about this game's overworld and what they need to do in order to advance through it. This is how you start a goddamn video game, not some 6-hour-long intro sequence, not an anime cutscene that has no bearing on the story until 20 hours in when you don't even remember it, and not through a litany of dialogue and trailing missions that bore a player to death. No, Zelda has, just through pure gameplay and a well-designed opening scene, taught the player all they need to know. Now go ahead and enjoy the game, kiddo. And oh boy, is it enjoyable. Zelda's main gameplay consists of 2 parts, exploration and dungeon diving, which of course also involves some detective work in order to beat, but will instead put the player into a more controlled environment where the design of the dungeon and the minds of the developers are allowed to work their magic. Let's start, however, where the game starts, exploration. The overworld of Zelda is divided into 128 tiles, all fully explorable and nearly all of them containing a secret of some kind, mostly in the form of a cave or underground, basement, spider hole, whatever's under these bushes you burned down. Within these caves ranges a number of different secrets, usually depending on the difficulty in discovering that particular location. Most of the caves you'll find near the starting point of the map will have a standard shop selling bombs or a blue candle or an overpriced magical shield item in them, while some will have minor hints or not have an apparent use at all. But as you pan out to farther, more dangerous corners of the map, they'll start to give out better rewards, like a new sword, or more important hints, or even a letter that allows you to buy potions. These discoveries are mostly necessary ones to make if you want to progress through the game. That is, the caves you see in the overworld simply by exploring are going to hold items you'll require for beating Zelda. But the caves you discover through more detailed, optional exploration, via burning bushes, blowing up walls, or simply exploring a suspicious-looking natural feature, will net you greater rewards that can fuel your forward momentum through the game's more challenging dungeons, such as discovering heart containers, rupee caches, and other such little goodies. And good lord, are you going to need the help, because while Zelda's dungeons may start simple, they will quickly evolve into much greater tests of the player's skill. But while I could talk at length about those later challenges, I want to start with the very first dungeon, because even though it's the easiest, it's definitely the most important when trying to understand why this game's design is so effective at teaching the player the game's rules as they play along, and how this design philosophy allows the developers to create more complex and challenging dungeons as the game goes on, without leaving the player behind. In Zelda, dungeons are the most important part of every game, from Breath of the Wild's whopping 120 shrines to this very first game's 8. The goal, as the startup screen and manual do inform you, is to find all 8 pieces of the Triforce that are hidden in these dungeons, and then kill Ganon. On top of all this, the dungeons are the most intricately designed part of each Zelda game in terms of puzzles, combat, and general detective work that the player must do in order to advance through to the end. These facts, combined with the development of the dungeons themselves taking the most time and effort from the dev team, is what makes most players, myself included, put so much emphasis on the dungeon design when examining which Zelda game they like the most. As such, I want to put a fair amount of time into analyzing how well or poor the dungeon design of each Zelda game is. As that consistent factor among these many games, I believe will lead to the most accurate analysis I can make on their quality. So to start off on that note, let's talk about dungeon level 1. Level 1 is relatively straightforward when compared to the game's future dungeons. But that's because the point of this dungeon and its design is to acclimate the player to this new environment, while also subtly teaching them all the rules that every dungeon hereafter shall follow. Upon entering, the player will, once more, be thrusted into a brand new world, signaled not only by the complete change in scenery and lighting, but also the dungeon music, which adds to the dark, claustrophobic tone set about by the dimly lit stone rooms that make up each dungeon. Just like at the very beginning of the game, the player is presented with a few choices as to which direction he would like to head, east or west. There is a third choice present as well, north. But try that, as many players might do, and you'll learn the first rule of Zelda dungeon design. Some doors are locked, and will, as indicated by the big keyhole, need a key to open them. Immediately, however, the player now understands that traversal of dungeons is identical to that of the overworld. Dungeons are split into screens. The player may move in 4 directions, and the player may also choose whichever way he wishes to go. Though, unlike in the overworld, there is now a short-term goal presented to the player as well, via the locked doors that he must open. At this point, the player will make his decision and choose which one of the open doors to go through, where he will be greeted by either a room of Keese or Stalfos. Defeating them shall net the player a key, which establishes the second rule of Zelda's dungeons. Rooms will have combat challenges, some of which are necessary in order to advance through the dungeon. The player can, of course, choose the other room too, which will net them 2 keys and let them understand the value in exploration. More exploration, as this teaches, nets further rewards, at the expense of more combat challenges to overcome. Further into the dungeon, you will encounter a new type of door, one that does not have a keyhole. How then, an inquisitive player might think, may I open it? Well, there's a very suspiciously placed single block in that room that throws off any symmetry that the room may have had, and in literally every other room up until this point, all blocks like this have been accompanied by more identical looking ones that are placed in such a way that the room is symmetrical. This should set off a good player's instincts and immediately flag that block as suspicious, making it rather obvious for the player to interact with it, and oh look, now the door is open. This establishes rule number 3. These blocks are movable, and the doors that don't have keyholes will require the player to move one in order to open them. The next room carries a dungeon map, which, combined with the compass the player may have discovered earlier, will teach the player the next rule. Each dungeon has a map that will help the player be a little less lost. While for this first dungeon, the map is not a huge deal, the dungeon map will be absolutely necessary for the player to find come the final level. So establishing the existence of the dungeon map in level 1 by not hiding it like in future levels is brilliant. If the player goes north, they'll eventually find level 1's basement, which holds the bow, establishing the 5th rule of Zelda's dungeons. Each level holds a neat little goodie inside that will add to Link's arsenal and further his quest in defeating Ganon. Encountering the final boss, we learn the final rule of Zelda's dungeons taught in level 1. Each level will have a final boss who, upon his defeat, shall net the player a heart container, increasing his health bar and opening the way to the Triforce shard, which then boots the player out of the dungeon with his health fully restored. With that, Level 1 of The Legend of Zelda has established every basic rule of all the dungeons in the game going forward. One level in, and there are no questions left for the player to ask, freeing up the developers and the player by allowing the successive dungeons to now build off of these fundamental rules. What an incredible game this is. Here Zelda is, 35 years ago, managing to teach the player all of the basic skills required to beat it without the use of a single tutorial or pop-up, and all in the span of the first level. Why can't so many games into the modern era do the same thing? Seriously, who designs this shit? For the sake of comparison, let's look at, say, Persona 5, which, okay, it's a pretty fun game. But despite the mid and late game quality you'll find many hours into the game, this shit has one of the worst openings I've ever experienced in a video game. First thing that happens is you're thrusted into a tutorial on how to do combat, then movement, then stealth, and then platforming? This shit is just bloated with tutorials, and then it just ends and sends you back in time. You navigate through the fucking Tokyo train system and, okay, pause the video. What the actual fuck were the developers thinking at this point? When I first played this, it took me at least half an hour to figure this shit out, because I can't read Japanese. And I thought, damn, this is the game? But no, that literally never happens again. You just fast travel anytime you want to go somewhere. Like, what? Who fucking put this in the game? Seriously, whoever it was, fuck you. Then it takes 6 hours of dialogue and geography classes before you're allowed to play the game again, and what the shit? I can't remember a goddamn thing from that tutorial earlier because it was 6 hours ago, and even the game expected that, so the tutorial happens again! Why? Why does this game have 2 identical tutorials? This is not how you design a video game under no circumstances. And if Persona 5 is the textbook example of how not to begin a game, then Zelda is its antithesis, and is a brilliant masterclass for any aspiring developer who does not yet understand the importance of showing and not telling a player how the game works. Before moving on to the other dungeons designs, I should mention that, unlike every other Zelda game, there is no waypoint on the map for your next quest, and no one tells you where the next dungeon is either. Much like in Breath of the Wild, which dungeons you find and choose to do are mostly up to you. Now, a few dungeons have a bit of a soft lock to them, like level 4 requiring the raft found in level 3, level 5 requiring the ladder found in level 4, and level 7 requiring the flute found in level 5. And of course, the final dungeon requires that you put back together the Triforce via completing all the previous dungeons. On top of this, the difficulty of these ladder dungeons will also discourage players from completing them, but otherwise, the order you do the dungeons in is up to you. I remember that during my first playthrough, I went through levels 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then 2, and on my most recent playthrough, for the sake of this review, I tried to mostly go in order, doing levels 1, 3, 2, 4, 5, 7, 6, then 8. And while most players will do level 1 first, and nearly all will do 3, 4, and 5, one after another, the question of what order did you do the dungeons in will mostly vary from player to player. And this freedom in allowing the player to beat the game in whatever order they want to makes the experience of playing Zelda again fresh and fun every single time I've come back to it. Moving on to levels 2 and 3, of which you'll at least have to complete the latter of before moving on to the other dungeons, these are both designed to teach the player how to use bombs, both as tools of traversal and armaments in combat. If you hadn't figured it out already, bombs can be used to open hidden doors, a lesson these dungeons teach you by dropping bomb pickups in rooms after you clear a combat challenge, with a suspicious-looking blank wall greeting you. You'll also be encouraged to use these bombs to take on the final boss, which in level 2 is Dodongo, who must be killed by feeding him bombs, centipede style. And in level 3 is Monhanla. What the fuck is up with these names? Who, while not immune to sword stabs or arrows, is a tough son of a bitch without the use of a well-placed bomb that could potentially one-shot him, if you place it well enough. Or might just piss him off if you don't. Either way, the player now comes out with one more valuable lesson. Bombs are useful as all hell, and be sure to use them to open up new paths in the game world. This is a concept that will eventually be necessary to find the final dungeon, and of course, open up some of the game world's best secrets. Level 4 is smart in that it lowers the individual combat challenges that the player will face, as Vires and Zols are much easier to deal with than the previous level's Dark Nuts or Ropes, but it ups the overall challenge by introducing the next dungeon mechanic, the mini-boss, who is once again the Manhanla. If I have to say that name one more time, I'm gonna slam my head against this desk. On top of that, the dungeon boss, the two-headed Gleeok, is really tough, and it was at this point during my latest playthrough that I died for the first time. And then I died the second, third, fourth, and fifth times before I finally beat him. And if that doesn't indicate how these dungeons will be going forward, then, well... Level 5, or 6 if you're brave enough, is where the game gets hard, and if you take a step back and realize where the player is at this point in the game, it begins to make sense why. At this point, the player has most definitely beaten levels 1, 3, and 4, so he'll now understand all of the rules that dungeons in Zelda are supposed to follow, as well as how combat and enemy patterns work, and now will have access to most of the world's optional content via the equipment that he's acquired in these dungeons. In fact, an inquisitive or veteran player at this point can actually acquire all of the overworld's discoverable heart containers, as well as gain access to potions, the magic shield, the white sword, and the blue ring, which halves incoming damage. Of course, most players won't discover all of these items by the 5th dungeon, but even a combination of half of the above pieces of gear will severely buff the player compared to how they were at the game's start. It is only logical then, for the sake of game balance and keeping the game challenging, that a major difficulty spike occurs, and oh boy, do these next 2 dungeons get difficult. Level 5 starts off throwing new, tougher enemies at the player from the very get-go. Upwards are the Gibdos, who are significantly beefier than the undead Stalfos you've been fighting up until this point. And to the right are Pulse Voices, who are practically impossible to kill without the white sword. Luckily, the white sword is only a couple tiles away from the dungeon, so the player should hopefully have it at this point. If not, however, its proximity to level 5 will make its discovery rather easy. Using the key you got from the Pulse Voices, you'll learn how to kill the boss, with a sound he does not like, whatever that means. Up ahead from the northern room is the mini-boss, 3 Dodongos. This is a hard obstacle to pass, as they will require 6 bombs to kill, while Link can only carry 8. Fuck up more than twice, and you'll need more bombs, which happened to me once, because these things like to turn at the last minute a lot. If you've been paying attention to the last few dungeons, though, and see via the map where the next rooms are, you can actually blow up a wall and bypass the Dodongo fight entirely. And in case you're wondering, no, I did not know this when last playing through the game. And I only just figured this out while looking at the level map, and yeah, I'm mad at myself for that because that would have saved a lot of time. But if anything, this proves how well hidden so many of the game's secrets are. I've played it 3 times now, all the way through, and just figured this out while researching after the fact. And that's something I always like to see in a game that touts itself on its sense of exploration, like Zelda does. Next are some blue Dark Nuts you'll have to kill, and you'll run into your first dungeon basement that serves not to grant a new item to the player, but as transport across the level map. In this upper section you've been transported to, you'll encounter more Dark Nuts guarding the flute, which you'll likely then piece together as the thing that makes a sound that Dig Dogger, the dungeon boss, will hate. You can also find your first bomb upgrade in here, which is super useful for expanding the player's ability to explore the overworld. And now you can finally fight your way to the boss, then use the flute and get the Triforce. From Dark Nuts to Pulse Voices to dodging magic attacks while playing a flute and stabbing the Dig Dogger, the player is truly tested on his ability to not just rely on his new gear, which has been allowing him to tear ass through the Octoroks and Moblins of the overworld, but also on his skill level and ability to apply what he's learned up until this point about the game's many different mechanics. It should be no surprise then that the next level will also challenge these same elements. But unlike level 5, which mostly did so through throwing difficult but unrelated enemies at the player to acclimate them to the difficulty spike, level 6 will instead make some very deliberate choices about the design of its combat engagements that will challenge the player like never before. Level 6 begins with the introduction of this dungeon's main new enemy, the Wizrobe, who will split himself into copies, intelligently place himself so that he attacks the player from several directions, and then fires a magic blast. This is a major red flag for any player that has yet to acquire the magic shield. All of the enemy's projectiles in this dungeon will be magic-based, and this is a blatant message to the player that they should only advance through if they are prepared. Advancing further north, the player will encounter Zols, then Keys surrounded by magic turrets, then a trap room, and finally the player's first real challenge, a room with yellow and blue Wizrobes. The blue ones not splitting into copies, but instead teleporting around the room and spamming magic attacks at the player. If you don't have a magic shield, as the level already indicated you should get before entering further, these things will kick your ass. On top of all that, however, is an additional enemy, the Like-Like. Like-Likes will eat your shield if you get caught by one, and if you lose your magic shield to one at this point, you're toast. Luckily, this room is rather open, so you're allowed to acclimate to this new deadly combination of enemies by being able to keep away from the Like-Likes while also dealing with the Wizrobes. Regardless of that little bit of help, this first room introduces the concept of a deadly combination of enemies. The supports, who will try to take away your defenses, the ranged attackers, who will keep a distance and force the player to move from time to time to avoid their attacks, and the Berserker, who will get up in your face and spam magic attacks, which, while easy to block with a shield, will be devastating if you manage to get caught by a Like-Like first. This is an absolutely brilliant difficulty spike. None of these enemies are hard to deal with on their own. After all, the player's already killed 2 rooms full of yellow Wizrobes in order to get to this point. And the blue ones, for all their attack power, are stopped in their tracks by a magic shield and a couple well-placed sword stabs. And Like-Likes, for all the fear these things might put into me due to their ability to eat my shield, are slow and easy to kill without the player ever being caught by one. But by putting all 3 together, a deadly combination of foes with great synergy is created. Many games just like to throw random enemies at the player for the sake of variety, and their idea of hard enemy encounters is the same enemy as before, but with more health and damage. To be clear, no player is interested in facing the same enemy as before with only a buff to the numbers in their damage and defense outputs. What interests players is an enemy or enemies that feel difficult due to much clearer explanations. Their amount, their size, and most clever of all, their synergy. This applies to all games, and it's often what separates good shooters from bad shooters, at least when talking about their single-player campaigns. Play a Battlefield campaign, and you'll be bored at how stupid and lifeless the enemy AI is, but play Halo Combat Evolved, and holy shit! You're dodging plasma grenades, mowing down weak grunts while the tougher elites follow up to catch you off guard. The hunters are the only enemy who can't be killed with a simple frontal assault, so you're gonna have to use your better agility to get behind them and strike. But if they have some jackals with a needler to support them, you'll have to deal with them first, lest you die. It's the synergy of these individually weaker enemies that they all have with one another that makes this game one of my personal favorites in terms of fair difficulty spikes. And the best balanced games, in my opinion, should try to create similar acting enemy encounters that get hard due to the AI's ability to work together to kill the player. And Zelda does just that. This is the moment the developers are saying, alright, you got this far and killed a lot of enemies on their own, but can you handle them when they work together? This is a much better way of increasing the difficulty than just arbitrarily buffing the enemy's stats, and I can't give this game enough praise for managing that all the way back in 1986. Now, I have fun while playing all parts of this game, but this mid-game difficulty spike, which introduces enemy synergy and tougher mini-boss encounters, is what keeps the game challenging and fun even after all this time. Something which levels 8 and 9 shall continue to build on. Wait, hold on a second. There's a level 7 in this game? What happened to that one again? This level sucks. If there's a low point in this game, this is it. I actually had trouble remembering what even happened in this dungeon, even though I only played through it a couple hours before writing this sentence. Now, compared to these games' dungeons, this one's fine. It's not even particularly unfun, it's just completely uncreative and filled with enemies that don't challenge the player at all. Compared to the last 3 dungeons, one of which you had to complete before doing this one, level 7 feels easy, bland, and uncreative in comparison. This whole dungeon is filled with nothing but Gorias, the weak boomerang-throwing enemies you encountered in levels 1 and 2. That's it, and they aren't a challenge. You can just block all of their attacks with your shield while killing them at a distance with your sword beam or magic rod. There is nothing challenging about this at all. On top of all that, the mini-bosses are all weak as hell too. 3 Dodongos greet you for a second time, but that's not even a big deal anymore since you'll have 12 or even 16 bombs at this point, since this dungeon holds a second bomb upgrade for the player to grab up. That's literally to the north of the Dodongo room. A couple of Digdoggers are also thrown in here, which are pretty easy to kill when you use the flute on them first. Then Moldorms are introduced, and these are without a doubt the weakest enemies this dungeon has to offer, even though they're put in these big-ass rooms all by themselves, as though they're meant to be a big deal. All you have to do is swipe at them a few times and bam, dead. Well, at least you'll get the super useful red candle in here, but then you'll head to the boss room and... Wait, what the fuck? Is that actually the boss from the first level being copied and pasted over to this one? No joke, this thing isn't even buffed at all to compensate for the fact that you're 7 levels into the fucking game. You can even block its attacks with the magic shield, something no other boss attack can be stopped with. Who the fuck at Nintendo thought this was okay? Was it you, Miyamoto? This dungeon is a fucking cakewalk, and is honestly an insult to the player's skill level at this point in the game. I don't know who at Nintendo thought this was an appropriate late game dungeon, but whoever it was, fuck you. This is the one dip in quality that The Legend of Zelda has in its runtime, but honestly, compared to a lot of other games, it's not so bad. The worst thing I can say about how I felt when actually playing it is that when I looked over to my notebook I'd been keeping for this review after finishing it, the first thing I thought was, wait, what happened in that dungeon again? If that's not a forgettable level, I don't know what is. After the challenges that level 5 and 6 present to the player, level 7 and its lack of intelligent design can't help but feel underwhelming. Luckily, that's a problem that won't persist, because the dip in Zelda's quality ends as soon as you enter level 8, appropriately titled, The Lion. Level 8 brings the challenge right back to the forefront of Zelda's dungeons. If you completely cut level 7 from the game, this would feel like the natural next step from level 6. From the start of the dungeon, the eastern room holds a single key and nothing else, but head west and you'll be immediately greeted by one of Zelda's tougher mini-bosses again, the Monhanla. Beyond that are a couple of challenge rooms until you reach the basement and get the Book of Magic. If you then want to go further into the dungeon, however, you'll have to fight a second mini-boss, the Monhanla. The rooms from this point forward will branch off in 2 paths. West, which will hold combat challenges and the information as to where the final dungeon is, and north, which is the shorter, more direct route to the dungeon boss. There is also, however, an entirely hidden part of the dungeon even further north, revealed by a bomb blast, which is super fucking cool to discover. The player is first hinted at its existence due to the fact that if you explore the rest of the dungeon first, you'll never run into a dungeon map, an item that the very first dungeon established as always being present. This hidden section, however, starts with another boss fight, the Monhanla. Then, the following paths shall lead to the magical key, an optional item that will eliminate the need for the player to find extra keys from now on. To get to the end, you'll fight a room's worth of Pulse Voices, then one of Darknuts, and finally, face the 4-headed Gleeok. Now, unless if you missed a dungeon or 2 by this point, you'll have all the pieces of the Triforce and can finally face Ganon in The Legend of Zelda's final dungeon. Death Mountain is a hellscape. One thing that I love about every Zelda game, besides this one, is that somehow, even in some of the bad ones, Nintendo seems to consistently manage to create a final dungeon that requires the player to reflect on all they've learned during their journey and use all the gear that they have acquired along the way in order to make it through the last dungeon. My favorite Zelda games seem to get their endings right more so than all the other ones. Link to the Past has an incredibly tall tower to ascend full of the game's earlier bosses, and multiple of them at that, while you're zipping around with the hookshot to make it to the top of the tower and kill Aghanim. Ocarina of Time takes you back through your journey by giving you mini sections related to the previous dungeons, only to then throw adult Link into unfamiliar territory with his final ascent up Ganon's tower, as the music becomes louder and louder as you reach the top. And Twilight Princess has the player cycling through their past gear like a madman, switching between human and wolf Link and fighting tough mini-bosses along the way before they can finally face down Ganon. And the original Legend of Zelda, for how limited its graphics are, is still able to create a sense of stakes and difficulty that befits a final showdown with the Prince of Darkness himself, Ganon. I have yet to talk about Ganon, or honestly the plot of this game at all, and that's mostly because if you just start it up and play the game, none of it has any relevance to what you're doing whatsoever. By reading the manual or letting the title screen play out and reading that, you can learn the premise, but honestly, this is a big nothing burger. The story doesn't matter, and there isn't any dialogue until Zelda tells you that you're a hero for killing Ganon and saving Hyrule, so whoop-de-fucking-do. I want to preface, however, that while the story does not matter in this game, that will one day change quite a bit, and once I get to the Link to the Past review onwards, I will begin to take the story of these games into account when analyzing their quality. But for now, we're in the NES era, and the story doesn't matter due to its absence in the actual game itself, which is what I'm reviewing after all. Still, Ganon does manage to come off as an intimidating boss when you face him. Compared to previous boss sprites, he is massive, and that size, combined with his ability to teleport and turn invisible, makes him a terrifying boss every time I encounter him. So on that note, let us examine the final dungeon that shall lead to your final showdown with the Prince of Darkness, Death Mountain. As I've already said, Death Mountain, or level 9, is going to test all of the player's skills up until this point of the game. The like Wizrobe tag team from level 6 makes its triumphant return, and on top of the new land molas, who come in pairs to block off certain areas, there is also the Patra, a new mini-boss who will kick the shit out of players who don't understand spacing. The Patra is a tough cookie to take down, and there are 4 of them, with each successive one changing its attack patterns ever so slightly in order to shake things up and keep the player's attention. Beyond those combat challenges though, this dungeon is a fucking doozy. You can find 2 different pieces of equipment, the Silver Arrow and the Red Ring, the first of which is required to kill Ganon, and the second is completely optional and well hidden. But getting to these pieces of equipment, as well as the map, the compass, and Ganon himself, is pretty damn difficult. There are so many branching paths, but they're also at least organized and cut off from one another using dungeon basements, and there are a couple of old men along the way to give you a little hint as to where you should go next. So while it's challenging and requires detective work and splunking on the player's part, it never felt particularly unfair to me, like plenty of other NES games generally do by their final level. Now, if there's one thing you should know about me going forward with these reviews on Zelda games, it's that I love dungeons like these. Any dungeon that forces me to remember branching paths and choose which direction I want to go through first is a huge treat to me. It's the labyrinthian-like dungeons, or the ones with complex puzzles, that are my favorite of the series. As such, level 9 serves as a wonderful last stop on this journey, at least for players like me who want a maze to work their way through while fighting tough enemies or solving puzzles along the way. And if that doesn't describe the optimal Zelda dungeon, I don't know what does. Zelda, to me at least, is a game about exploration, discovery, and adventure, and it's dungeons like level 9, which create labyrinths through which the player must map out and discover the right way forward, that epitomize that design philosophy to me the most. which is likely why level 9 is my favorite dungeon of all the ones in this original game. Once you do get through it though, you'll encounter Ganon, who's rather easy to beat if you know how to kill him. Depending on the player, he'll either be the easiest or hardest boss you face, but regardless of how much or little trouble he gives you, you'll eventually overcome him, finally save the princess, and then the game ends. Or so it would, if not for a simple mistake that Tezuka, the game's designer, made all these many years ago. Apparently, when handed the dungeon designs for The Legend of Zelda, he only managed to put in half of them, the original 8 levels and Death Mountain. But in doing so, he decided to fit them in such a way that they only took up half of the floppy disk's memory. Miyamoto, it was said, playtested this half-finished version anyway and said it felt perfect, and having played the game myself, I absolutely agree with him. Another 9 dungeons probably would have been too much for a single playthrough. So with the other half of the game's storage, Miyamoto told the team to create a second quest, a rearranged version of the game with the other 9 dungeons in them instead. This, combined with the rearranged locations of secrets, makes it feel like an immediate sequel, or like it's 2 games packaged on one disc. I won't spend any time going through these dungeons individually like I did with the first quest, because unlike in the first quest, the second quest expects the player to know the rules of the game beforehand, as you've already beaten it once to get to this point. I am also of the opinion that, while the second quest is a neat way to extend the runtime of the game, The Legend of Zelda proper is in that very first quest, and ending your playthrough there of the game, as well as this nitty-gritty review of it, would make sense. I will leave the exact details of this rearranged map and its discoveries completely up for you to discover. I will just briefly say, however, that they're all quite challenging, and do a wonderful job at providing a tough second playthrough for a seasoned player. The Legend of Zelda was a breakout hit for a reason, or, as I just detailed, several very specific reasons. And to end where we began, I'd like to say that I find Nintendo's lack of commitment to seeing this very first game get more credit rather odd. As some of you may be aware of, Eiji Aonuma, the man who I previously criticized for trying to sell Breath of the Wild fans Skyward Sword, has actually talked before about how the very first Legend of Zelda game was the inspiration behind Breath of the Wild. You can see it most obviously in much of the promotional art, but also in many of his previous statements, where he also claims that he wanted to get away from the gameplay formula first created by Ocarina of Time and followed through with until Skyward Sword. Despite that fact, and the success of Breath of the Wild both financially and critically, Nintendo is still yet to make any dedicated attempt at capitalizing on this game's well-received design philosophy. If they did, I would think that creating a true remake of this original game would be a much better step forward for the series than their current plans. After all, it is 35 years old, and its biggest drawback, I'm afraid, is that age. As sad as I am to say it, I don't know how many people these days are willing to give an old NES game a try, even if Nintendo puts it on their most current hardware. For example, the original Fire Emblem was recently released digitally on the Switch, and while playing it, I found that its gameplay was nearly identical to that of the series' most recent iteration. And while it didn't have nearly as much dialogue between the playable characters as Three Houses does, that's not entirely a bad thing.
Underestimating the Knights was an amateur mistake, one you will pay for. The road to eternal torment awaits you all. Now I must locate your replacements.
Wait! Get back here! Damn you!
What the hell? And yet, this original game, despite it being so very similar to the modern titles in terms of gameplay, has some pretty terrible reviews when compared to this shit.
Stop right there!
Who the fuck wrote this? So, why is that the case then? Well, presentation is what I think it is, and I mean that in more ways than just graphics in the case of Fire Emblem. I honestly believe that if these games didn't have so much waifu bait in them, then Intelligent Systems would have gone out of business 10 years ago. All of this is to say that the original Legend of Zelda has not aged well in that one oh-so-important department: presentation, and that's why it's so disappointing to me to see more recent games like Skyward Sword get a release on Nintendo's more current hardware, when I think that this original Legend of Zelda game both needs and deserves it the most. I don't know why, to this day, Nintendo has refrained from remaking this original game, considering just how many other Zelda games have gotten facelifts over the years, but I hope that one day this changes, so that everyone, even those who can't handle the old graphics and limited music, can enjoy this old masterpiece. Regardless of those concerns, this game is still a stroke of technical brilliance, and while I don't think I can recommend it to absolutely everyone, I do think that anyone who's even slightly interested in it after watching this video should give it a chance. And more specifically, if you consider yourself a Zelda fan, I think that there are few reasons to pass this one up. It is, after all, the very first game in the franchise, and thus far has had the biggest influence on the series' most modern title. Combine that with its solid dungeons, well-designed difficulty curve, and cleverly detailed overworld, and this is easily one of my favorite Zelda titles in the series. See, it sits right there at number 5. I give this game an 8.5 out of 10. This is a great game with a solid design philosophy in nearly every department, but it does lack in presentation, and that includes its complete lack of any stories or characters, as well as the graphics and limited soundtrack. And for as well designed as the combat and most dungeons are, the series has managed to achieve better in some of the future iterations. So I don't feel like I can quite let this game off the hook for that. Well, that's all for this video. Next up is Zelda 2. Fucking kill me. If you want to see a grown-ass man try his hardest not to lose the will to live as he plays a shitty game from the 80s, then be sure to subscribe so that you can follow along with me as I continue to review all the Zelda games, as well as any others I may feel like talking about at some point. Regardless, thanks for watching and have yourself a very nice day.